What if I told you the world around you could have been powered without wires, batteries, or fossil fuels, just energy flowing invisibly through the air? Tonight, you'll step into the world Nikola Tesla imagined but never saw completed. Imagine street lamps glowing without cables, ships sailing without fuel, and homes humming with power drawn directly from the earth itself. What kept humanity from this path? And what would your life look like if his Wardenclyffe Tower had succeeded? Stay with me as we wander into that alternate future Tesla dreamed of. Imagine a boy barely into his teenage years, pale and thin, clinging to life while fever gripped his body. He lies in a small room, the air heavy with the damp smell of medicine and oil lamps burning low through the night. His parents wait outside, not sure if they'll see him recover, as the doctor inside mutters predictions of death rather than survival. Yet the boy is not resigned. In the haze of sickness, his mind turns toward visions of astonishing machines and forces he doesn't yet know how to command. He whispers, almost as if to himself, that if he emerges from this illness alive, he will dedicate everything to understanding energy. You can picture that frail hand, gripping the bedsheet, holding not just the fight for breath, but an oath that would never leave him. Because in his mind, a second chance would not be wasted on ordinary tasks. It would be spent bending the hidden rhythms of the natural world into forms no one had ever seen. As strange as it may sound, the fever became less of an ending and more of a threshold. Many expect survival from such an illness to mean rest, quiet, and perhaps the compromise of a safer future. For him, it became the opposite. Recovery was not a gift to slow down, but an invitation to speed forward. His family hoped he might follow his father into a predictable life of steady duties, the kind that shielded him from risk and left no ambition larger than the household. Doctors, having doubted whether he'd live, expected frailty ahead, not the kind of robust activity demanded by great ambition. And yet this boy's mind refused the boundaries of either medicine or family expectation. He had glimpsed something in those fevered nights, some clarity sharper even than pain. He saw himself not guided by constraint but by an unstoppable current running through both his body and the very earth beneath him. The pledges we make to ourselves in illness often fade once health returns. His became stronger, more pressing, as if enforced by survival itself. Recovery brought with it a restlessness almost impossible to satisfy. Rather than taking long walks or tending to small tasks as his parents suggested, he hid scraps of paper in his room filled with sketches of imaginary devices. They weren't childish doodles of wheels or boats, but intricate designs of machines with lines looping in shapes unknown to village blacksmiths. Nurses who had once feared for his life now saw him explaining concepts far beyond his years, insisting that one day he would draw invisible energy directly from the planet. The wild-eyed conviction of a convalescent boy might have been dismissed as delusion, but for him these sketches became markers of an inner map. Each drawing carried him one step closer to the notion that electricity, and perhaps more than electricity, lay waiting for human hands bold enough to grasp it without fear. In years since, psychologists studying the aftermath of near-death experiences have noticed how often survivors emerge with heightened purpose. The brush with mortality strips away hesitation, leaving a sharpened clarity, an obsessive alignment toward goals once only faintly imagined. For this boy, the sickness had done precisely that. Instead of sapping vitality, it seemed to channel every ounce of it into a singular directive. Never take existence for granted, and never abandon the pursuit of energy's secrets. He was no mere tinkerer, collecting hobbies. He embodied the kind of focus that appears only after someone stares at life's edge and chooses fiercely to turn back with a mission. In his case, every machine he would later attempt to construct carried the same stamp, the refusal of insignificance. Invention became less a trade than a proof of survival. the demonstration that his second chance mattered. Consider it this way. If the illness had claimed him, entire chapters of technological history might have closed before they opened. The notion that alternating electrical currents could be harnessed to light not only a room, but entire cities might never have found a champion so devoted. Visions of transmitting energy across distances without wires might have dissolved in obscurity, left untested. And all the latent speculation about signals from the stars, machines vibrating in time with the Earth, or weapons so absolute they could end war, all this would have remained imagination without a body willing to build. The fever did more than test his body's strength. It crystallized his role in the unfolding story of humanity's technological ambition. The boy who should have been buried beneath linens instead rose, carrying a flame powerful enough to inspire a lifetime of audacity. As his health returned, his father urged him toward a clerical life, one filled with books but limited by the structure of the pulpit. Yet the boy resisted. He argued that he wanted to dedicate himself not to scripture but to science, to the kind of exploration that reached beyond the safety of tradition. Still young, still fragile, he insisted that he had been spared for reasons larger than sermons or simple vows. One can almost hear the tension in that household. Parents fearing for their son's strength, while the boy himself insists on staking his every breath on what most people still considered dangerous experiments. He saw the earth not as stable ground beneath his feet, but as a conductor humming with untapped force. His family saw fragility. He saw destiny. The sketches grew more complex. He described to others visions of wheels spun without horses, of forces leaping invisibly between devices, and of currents strong enough to shake the very frame of buildings. To most, it sounded like delirium, the leftover residue of fever refusing to let go. To him, it was the most natural response to survival. Why remain timid when existence itself had proven so fleeting? If he could turn illness into vitality, perhaps energy could be turned into abundance. Perhaps scarcity itself could be eliminated. In the corridors of his mind, entire cities lit without fire or smog flickered vividly. His task was simply to endure long enough to bring fragments of these visions into the waking world. This transformative illness became both a crucible and a compass. Crucible, because it hardened a child into someone scorching with purpose. Compass, because it pointed him unerringly toward the theme that would dominate his life's work, energy as the common bloodstream of all human progress. He would spend decades pursuing it through countless forms, currents alternating back and forth, waves stabbing invisibly through the sky, oscillators tapping into the quake of the planet itself. Each idea stretched back, in one way or another, to that vow born of weakness. If survival had been chance, duty gave it shape. One can only wonder how many other brilliant paths flickered in history, extinguished when those children didn't recover. Here, by some improbable combination of will and circumstance, one survived, and in surviving, opened a path almost too vast to imagine. So the story begins not with a finished invention or triumphant experiment, but with sickness in a dimly lit room. Imagine yourself lying there, lungs struggling, hearing the murmur of family and doctors predicting loss. What promise would you make if you believed you might not see morning? Would you pledge gratitude and safety, or would you stake everything on a dream too intense to ignore? He reached for the latter. That choice shaped the trajectory not just of his own decades, but of the possibilities hovering over our world even tonight, because what he saw in fever did not end when the fever cooled. It pressed forward, urgent, relentless, demanding realization in sparks and towers and machines nobody else had yet dared to build. His illness was not a conclusion, but an ignition, the first surge of a mindset on channeling the hidden pulse of the natural world. From that moment on, the boy would no longer measure his life in ordinary years, but in the distance between what existed and what should exist. A second chance granted him not comfort, but a lifelong obsession with bringing energy into forms that could lift humanity's burdens. And it is here, standing at the threshold of recovery, that the path begins to curve toward encounters far larger than childhood struggle. Soon his spark would cross with another fire, one burning less with vision and more with profit. The fire of a man who would turn out to be his first and greatest rival, Thomas Edison. What if the turning point in the history of electricity didn't come from a vote in some quiet chamber, or from textbooks lined on shelves, but instead from an offhand betrayal worth $50,000? Imagine crossing an ocean with nothing but a head full of designs, landing in a new country where the streets smell of coal smoke and sweat, and believing your future rests in the workshop of a man already hailed as America's wizard. You picture stability, purpose and reward if only you work hard enough. Then, after you deliver on your word, the promised fortune disappears with a laugh and a comment meant to brush away your expectations. Insult replaces recognition. Confidence turns into anger. And in that moment, the future of how the world would be electrified starts to shift like a fault line snapping beneath your feet. Tesla arrived in America with little more than determination and sketches of machines tucked into his memory. He had no fortune to cushion him, relying instead on introductions, favours, and the sheer audacity to approach those who already controlled the field he wanted to conquer. Edison, established, pragmatic, and confident in his direct current system, represented both opportunity and authority in this new land. For Tesla, joining Edison's workshop wasn't just employment, it was a calling, a chance to become part of the roaring engine of modern progress. He worked tirelessly, refining motors, redesigning systems, and applying the brilliance that had been sharpened during those years of restless obsession in Europe. Each long night smoothing gears and recalculating circuits seemed like an investment in loyalty that would eventually pay him back. And for a while it almost felt as though he might find both mentor and partner in Edison. But partnerships balance on trust, and trust is fragile when filtered through money. One day, after taking on a demanding set of improvements in Edison's machines, Tesla returned not only with solutions but with efficiency levels far beyond what anyone expected. For him, the task was a puzzle, a challenge suited to his unique way of seeing invisible patterns. For Edison, the result should have meant a reward, a promised $50,000 payment that Tesla had taken at face value. When the time came to collect, the answer was not gratitude, not a handshake, but dismissal. Instead of cash, Tesla was told that he simply didn't understand American humour. The words cut deeper than any physical wound. To a man who had crossed an ocean for this chance, the joke was not only cruel, but life-altering. This wasn't just the story of a personal slight. It was the opening shot in a battle between two visions of power itself. Edison's practical mind looked outward and saw streets thick with wires, a world where every home would buy its electricity like bread from a bakery. A steady profit, safe for investors, and efficient enough to fuel the rise of American industry. Tesla, already envisioning something grander, imagined those wires stripped away, replaced by currents that leapt invisibly through air and earth. To him, the wires were chains. To Edison, they were lifelines. In that schism, one man believing in walls of copper, the other in resonance and freedom, the war for electricity began taking shape. Historians often trace the war of the currents to technical debates about alternating and direct current, but many point to that broken promise as fuel poured directly onto the fire. What might have remained a respectful rivalry hardened into deep opposition after that betrayal. Had Tesla remained under Edison's wing, perhaps alternating current would have taken longer to emerge, or been introduced in a subdued way. But by slamming the door in his face, Edison forced Tesla to take his talents elsewhere, to seek partners eager to humiliate Edison's monopoly. Betrayal created competition, and in that competition, electricity itself changed course. There's irony in how small the moment seemed at first. $50,000 to Edison was large, but not impossible. To Tesla, it was more than money. It was endorsement, resources, proof that his brilliance could command tangible value in this new land. Without it, he was displaced, bitter, but free. And freedom allowed him to sharpen his vision, to seek investors willing to let him pursue alternating currents that Edison dismissed as dangerous or impractical. Imagine, for just a second, if Edison had simply paid the man. Would Tesla have continued refining Edison's system? Would alternating current have been delayed by decades? Would the picture of glowing cities at night have been dimmer, more constrained, without Tesla's system reaching its full bloom? A single cruel joke may have rewritten the entire course of modern infrastructure. The insult lingered not just in Tesla's pride, but in his resolve. From then on, he bore less patience for compromise. Edison continued to string wires across neighbourhoods, each carrying current that faded after only short distances, each length demanding more copper, more labour, more expense. Tesla countered with alternating systems where one station could power entire stretches of land, current leaping like an invisible pulse across far distances. The two men came to embody not just different machines, but different futures. In Edison's world, companies tied neighbourhoods in cables, controlling them like nets. In Tesla's world, power belonged everywhere, not confined to wires, not bound by cost. And so the broken promise of $50,000 swelled into the foundation of the War of the Currents. But beneath the technology, it was also about trust, betrayal, and how vision responds to insult. Tesla might have been crushed by humiliation. Instead, he sharpened his commitment. Edison, perhaps amused at first, soon found himself forced to defend his empire as Tesla's ideas proved not only viable, but spectacular. Cities that Edison once thought would depend forever on short, costly cables began to leap toward Tesla's alternating current system, glowing brighter, spreading faster, embracing efficiency. The man who had been laughed out of Edison's workshop returned to challenge him in the most public way possible, through success. What stands out is how much of history turns not on treaties or wars, but on the fragile moments between individuals. A promise made and broken, a joke spoken and absorbed, shifts human destiny. In Tesla's case, that single incident carried him into partnerships with backers like George Westinghouse, who saw in him the chance to topple Edison's electrical empire. The very rival Edison had created through mockery now became the most dangerous threat to his monopoly. Once you notice the irony, it's hard to ignore how fate bends around slights both large and small. Entire industries rose because one man refused to pay and another refused to forget. For Tesla, losing $50,000 became more valuable than earning it, because in losing, he severed his tie to Edison's workshop, his reliance on another's approval, and his subtle attempts to conform to someone else's path. He walked away emboldened, no longer an immigrant begging for favour, but a visionary confident enough to chart his own. The insult clarified his destiny. It told him his future would not be built in the margins of Edison's empire, but on a separate foundation altogether, one rooted in alternating currents that could leap across continents. Betrayal hardened into independence. Opposition blossomed into revolution, and cities, nations, whole continents would soon bear the glow of that independence, washed in white light no joke could extinguish. So in the end, that supposedly humorous dismissal carried unintended consequences. Yes, Tesla lost his promised reward, but he gained a rival who gave his work direction, urgency, and scale. Edison's betrayal was money kept but legacy challenged, and Tesla's revenge would never be measured in payments, lawsuits, or debts. His revenge was quieter, brighter, far more enduring. His revenge lit entire cities. Picture yourself stepping onto the grounds of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair on a cool spring evening. The air smells faintly of roasted peanuts and coal smoke drifting in from the city. But here inside the fairground gates, the atmosphere shifts. Crowds move like a restless current, vendors shouting, brass bands echoing faintly through the hallways. Then a hush rolls across the walkways as voices quiet and eyes turn upward. A lever is pulled, and what was a dark field becomes something entirely new. 100,000 electric lamps flicker alive at once, not as lanterns fed with fuel, not with gas hissing into pipes, but lit by currents flowing invisibly through copper wires hidden beneath the soil. Suddenly, the fairgrounds glow as though noon has slipped back into the night. Children shield their eyes. Adults laugh nervously, muttering as if daylight itself has been trapped inside glass globes. And you, standing there, realize you have just stepped into electricity's decisive moment. This display was no accident of showmanship. George Westinghouse, the businessman who backed Tesla's alternating current system, had fought brutally to secure the contract. His competitors pushed the safety of Edison's direct current as the more practical option, whispering doubts into the ears of city officials, warning of disaster, hinting at fires. But bids are not just numbers, they are gambles on the future. And those officials took the gamble that alternating current could deliver cheaper, safer, brighter results. Tonight was the payout. In every direction you looked, the polyphase system Tesla had developed sent energy flowing smoothly, able to travel miles without losing strength, able to feed entire networks from a single station. The audience didn't see contracts or patents. What they saw was night itself torn open. To many visitors, the shock wasn't just brightness, but silence. Gas lamps hiss. Oil lamps flicker and spit. Fire carries movement and smoke, reminders of the world's fragility. Electricity here was clean. The lamps held still, humming quietly as if charged with magic. A woman carrying her child stopped suddenly, lifting her infant upward, as though to say, "This is the future you will know." The soot that stained buildings, the hazard of open flames in crowded streets, these were absent. Instead, the air seemed fresher, because light came not from burning, but from invisible force. For first-time spectators, it was as if someone had opened a hidden chamber in nature, one that had been locked away until this moment. Tesla had spent years imagining precisely this scene. His polyphase alternating current system wasn't just about lighting lamps. It was a language, a system capable of powering motors, factories, vast transportation networks. At Chicago, the lights were the showpiece, dazzling evidence that alternating currents were practical. When the lamps came to life in coordinated unison, they formed not just a display, but a declaration. Here was proof that power need not crawl along with wires every block. It could leap across long spans, efficient, powerful, waiting to be tapped by industries and households alike. No demonstration had ever been so public, so unforgettable. Newspapers scrambled to describe what they witnessed. Writers, armed only with metaphors, reached for words that could match the spectacle. Some called it an electrical wonderland, a phrase that carried both marvel and unease. For readers never able to attend, those descriptions painted vivid images of avenues lit, as if by an invisible sun, towers glowing, pavilions pulsing with steady radiance. Printed photographs hardly captured the intensity, but the reputation spread overnight. People spoke less of Edison's achievements, less of his safe, expensive direct current lines, and more about a Serbian-born engineer whose system of alternating currents had caught the world off guard. In city parlours and coffee houses, people debated what might happen if such power wasn't just for expositions, but became part of ordinary life. Consider the frame of mind of a visitor returning home after that fair. He lights his house still by lamp, the air heavy with kerosene. The upkeep costs money. The smell coats the curtains. The risk of fire remains constant. But he has now seen Chicago nights glowing without oil. Once imagination grips someone, routine becomes unbearable. The night spectacle transformed more than a single fair. It awakened citizens into demanding the same technology for themselves, and from demand came pressure on city planners, investors, politicians, all of whom were forced to reckon with whether alternating current, pioneered by Tesla, could serve the masses. Edison's speech about safety or simplicity began to sound smaller, less convincing, compared to what people had actually witnessed. For Tesla himself, this success was confirmation. Not only had the mathematics he scribbled years earlier taken shape in real hardware, but the crowd's reaction showed him the scale of possibility. If one city could be draped in light by his polyphase system, why not the continent? Why not the planet? Alternating current wasn't meant to remain a curiosity. It was, in his mind, the first rung on the ladder toward a world where energy moved freely, where towers could send power across oceans, and no human settlement was left in darkness. That conviction only deepened as he listened to the awed chatter in Chicago's streets. People didn't just see bright lamps, they glimpsed the promise of abundance. Yet beneath the marvel was tension. Edison supporters had warned about the danger of alternating current, insisting it could not be trusted in everyday life. Some even staged macabre demonstrations by electrocuting animals with AC to scare the public. So for Tesla, the triumph in Chicago wasn't merely about proving an idea, it was about pushing back fear. Each illuminated avenue became a rebuttal to the propaganda, each child laughing beneath the lamps another nail in the coffin of the rival technology. The glowing exposition told ordinary people, this is safe, this is real, and this is yours. And once imagination tilts, no demonstration of horror can undo it. Think of the mental shift that occurred almost instantly. Before the fair, electricity was still a curiosity, available mostly in urban centres, and even then accessible for the wealthy. Power was inconsistent, expensive, awkward. Afterward, the trajectory became inevitable. Everywhere industrialists glanced, they saw efficiency waiting to be captured at wider scales. Every mayor with ambitions of making his town modern could now point to Chicago as a clear model. And every common household dreamed that one day they might read, cook, or gather by steady, polished light untainted by smoke. Behind all of it was one mind that had refused compromise, one man who stared at his childhood vow during illness and carried it through broken promises to this absolute proof. The night Chicago lit up was proof that electricity could be not just a tool of the laboratory, but the architecture of an entire society. Standing amid those gasps of wonder, it was difficult to think only of lamps. You might also wonder what would happen if the same current surged into streetcars, powering silent fleets without steam, or if factories stopped coughing smoke because invisible flows of energy kept them running smoother, cleaner. And further still, what if those lines extended endlessly until the most remote corners of continents hummed with power? Electricity suddenly had no boundary other than vision. For the fairgoers, the memory lasted long after the exhibits closed. They carried home postcards, souvenirs, scraps of paper stamped with the fair's logo, yet these items were temporary. What lodged deepest was the recollection of night transformed into radiant day, proof visible not only to the eye but etched into the imagination. And, though most did not realise it, they had just witnessed the victory of alternating current over direct current, the end of Edison's dominance and the rise of Tesla's ideas into mainstream inevitability. Edison had fought valiantly in trademark disputes, in laboratory showdowns, but public opinion shifted fastest beneath great displays. And what display could rival the sudden lighting of the fair's White City, glowing endlessly until the very phrase Wonderland clung to it in the press? For Tesla, victory in Chicago wasn't ribbon-cutting or ceremony, it was vindication, living proof that his persistence through betrayal and struggle had yielded something indisputable. The lamps burned brightly, not merely as practical devices, but as symbols. that his polyphase system could extend wherever humans settled. Electricity stood no longer at the boundary of imagination. It had stepped firmly into daily possibility. He had once promised himself during his illness that he would master energy if he survived. That night, surrounded by strangers bathing in light, the vow no longer seemed private. It was shared silently by thousands around him who looked upward and believed they had glimpsed the true future. And so the Chicago night was more than spectacle. It was the opening chapter of a global transformation. What began as one fairground lit by curiosity hinted at entire continents stitched together by invisible power. If such radiance could stun a city into awe overnight, what might it mean scaled to the planet? Would distance vanish? Would scarcity shrink? Would human life realign itself under this new abundance? These questions hovered beneath the warm glow, waiting for the decades ahead. Tesla, however, was already moving past the lamps, past the applause. Standing in the crowd, his thoughts stretched not to those glowing domes alone, but to the entire Earth as canvas, because for him, Chicago was not the destination but a test. If alternating current could impress here, the possibilities extended infinitely outward. He saw not wires stretching indefinitely, but the entire globe resonating like a single instrument, a conductor large enough to send waves of energy to any corner, unrestricted, limitless. The lamps of Chicago were stepping stones, proof that the impossible could, under his guidance, become practical. And practical solutions, once glimpsed by the masses, always demand more. That night, Tesla's dream no longer lived only in sketches, patents, or quiet laboratory tests. It pulsed across an entire city's fairground, undeniable, shared, unforgettable. In that radiance, the future no longer belonged to darkness or wires thick as ropes tangled above streets. It belonged to currents invisible and generous, capable of blanketing nations. And so, as he walked away from the glowing avenues of the White City, his mind leapt to the greatest stage imaginable. The entire Earth itself. Imagine if a single tower, alone on a windy stretch of Long Island soil, had quietly poured energy into every home, every factory, every handheld device on the planet. No wires drooping over streets, no monthly bills folded into envelopes, no power companies counting profits, just an invisible current moving through the air itself, as natural as sunlight or air pressure. You would walk into your room, hold up a lamp, and it would glow because the Earth itself was carrying the energy to where you stood. That was Nikola Tesla's dream for Wardenclyffe, a dream he believed might outlast nations, might even outlast the idea of scarcity itself. The tower wasn't just a building. To Tesla, it was a keystone in the great bridge between his unfinished visions and the world that might have been. And tonight, sitting with the thought, you might begin to picture how different your life feels if that tower had succeeded. Now let's plant you there, at the beginning. The year's the early 1900s, the age of smoke-stained skylines and buzzing new technologies. Wall Street hums with speculation. Telegraph operators rattle away in crowded offices, and railroads glue together states with iron veins stretched over land. Into this chaos steps Tesla with a promise sweetened for ears trained on investment: global wireless telegraphy. He explains it to J.P. Morgan, a financier whose stern gaze rarely blinked at the future unless it promised immediate profit. To Morgan, the pitch made sense. Instant messages spanning oceans would be financial conquest, the kind of control elites craved. So Tesla wrapped his pitch in that language, describing wireless signals arcing through the atmosphere, bouncing from a carefully constructed tower into the distant world. And Morgan, impressed enough, signed the checks. For Tesla, those checks meant something broader, the possibility to hide within the project's language of communication a more secret aim: wireless power transmission itself. Wardenclyffe rose slowly, awkwardly, like a giant left half finished in the fields of Shoreham, New York. 187 feet of skeletal framework, topped with a copper dome that gleamed against the clouds. To ordinary eyes in the village below, the structure looked like an unfinished lighthouse or perhaps a communications mast. It drew curiosity, suspicion, sometimes even laughter. But to Tesla, every bolt, every iron plate, and every copper line sunk into the ground was essential. He wanted to use not just the air, but the earth itself as a conductor. In his notes and diagrams, he wrote obsessively about resonance, the idea that the planet had its own natural frequencies that technology could sync with, like a tuning fork amplifying a faint vibration into a thunderous hum. If tapped correctly, those frequencies could turn the entire globe into a gigantic electrical circuit, pulsing with untold energy waiting to be plucked out of the sky. Consider the scale if he had succeeded. Imagine a family in rural India, far from cities, able to light their homes simply because a small receiver absorbed power beamed invisibly through the ground. Imagine locomotives rushing across Siberia without burning coal, their engines alive with free pulses of wireless current. Imagine no towering pylons of high-voltage lines cutting across landscapes, no blackouts triggered by storms snapping wires, no monopolies demanding payment simply to keep a lamp alive. Energy in Tesla's mind was not a commodity to meter and sell. It was elemental, like rain. It fell freely and should be captured freely. But energy companies are not built on generosity. And financiers like J.P. Morgan measured futures in profit margins, not utopias. At first, Morgan tolerated Tesla's ambition because he believed it stayed tethered to communication. But as Tesla spoke more openly of universal power access, of light glowing anywhere simply by virtue of standing on Earth's surface, Morgan grew colder. Free energy did not sell shares. It threatened entire industries, mines that pulled copper from the ground, factories that fabricated cable, companies charging monthly fees for electricity. Each of them relied not on abundance but on scarcity. If Tesla made power unlimited, wealth built on restrictions would unravel. And so, the resources slowed, the checks stopped, and the tower stood incomplete on the Long Island coast. A strange skeleton of ambition surrounded by weeds. The townspeople whispered. Some said Tesla had lost his mind. Others said the tower was a weapon or a listening device. In reality, it was both less and more. Less. Because the experiments never completed, Tesla never managed to test the full system as he intended. More. Because if even fragments of his theory proved correct, energy distribution itself might have jumped a century forward. Wardenclyffe never hummed with the power he imagined. Instead, it drifted into debt, abandoned like an artifact. By 1917, the army worried that the tower could serve as a landmark for enemy ships offshore, and it was brought down with explosives, the dream collapsing into rubble long before its claim could be verified. Now pause here and picture the alternate world. No electrical grids as we know them, no spools of wire stretching across valleys. Instead, a network of resonant towers stitched across continents, turning whole countries into radiant receivers. Think about your morning routine under that system. Your phone draws current not through a cord, but automatically, streaming energy as effortlessly as you fill your lungs with oxygen. Cars glide without charging stations. Remote villages hum with the same intensity as city streets. No delay, no lag of infrastructure. The concept of energy poverty never exists. Wars fought over oil reserves lose purpose. The global balance of power shifts, not to whoever owns the mines or the pipelines, but perhaps to engineers tuning towers in farmlands and ports. Scarcity fades. Accessibility defines human life instead. That possibility lingers like a phantom. Historians pore over Tesla's technical notes, retracing his calculations on resonance and conductivity, wondering whether the physics was within reach. Evidence suggests he truly believed the Earth could be treated as a vast transmission circuit, that with the right adjustments, energies would reverberate around the globe. Some argue he misjudged practical limits of energy loss. Others suspect only financial starvation halted proof. But whether feasible or not, the imagination holds onto Wardenclyffe as an emblem. Because while other inventors calculated profits, Tesla cast his eyes over humanity as a species, wondering, what if energy was no longer controlled? What if it became as ubiquitous as the air you breathe right now? Picture again that copper dome catching sunlight on clear mornings, corroding slowly in salt air as rumours swirled about its purpose. To villagers, perhaps it was only curiosity. To Tesla, it was unfinished symphony. He walked the grounds, often alone, muttering calculations, seeing in his mind's eye receivers glowing with energy across oceans. He saw empathy in abundance, the same way hunger decreases when grain is free. He imagined no peasant shivering in darkness, no clerk paying an oppressive power bill, no household forced to choose between light and food. Energy was to him more than technology. It was dignity, liberation, an equalizer waiting to be unlocked. And yet, it fell. The explosion in 1917 ended the tower's physical existence, but not its symbolic one. Every time new technologies flirt with wireless power, echoes of Wardenclyffe return. Even now, as small devices begin charging on pads without cables, or as research explores beaming solar energy from orbit back to Earth, Tesla's ghost lingers. It whispers through diagrams in textbooks, through prototypes in laboratories, through every frustrated sigh at a monthly energy bill. Perhaps the world wasn't ready. Perhaps capitalism wasn't ready. Perhaps resonance was still a little beyond our reach. But the idea refuses to die. So when you walk through a city filled with wires overhead, hums vibrating from transformers, meters ticking at every doorstep, you are walking through the road not taken. These are the physical scars of a choice. The choice to leave Tesla's tower incomplete, to bury the promise under rubble and balance sheets. Somewhere, buried in that choice, lies the road that might have rewritten human life entirely. And though Wardenclyffe rests as a ruin in memory, its ghost remains whenever we ask that quiet, aching question. What if free power was real all along? That ghost lingers as we move forward, because Wardenclyffe was not the only device Tesla imagined. His notebooks brimmed with creations so peculiar, so strange, that they stretched the edge between science and science fiction. And once the tower faded, his restless mind wandered to machines capable of shaking the very bones of cities. What if buildings never collapsed at all, but instead learned to sway with the rhythm of the earth itself, saved not by brute force, but by a small humming device no larger than a brick? Imagine a city where earthquakes were not disasters, where towers bent gracefully in tune with tremors, rocking calmly before returning upright, like reeds in wind. That was the spectre Tesla toyed with one day in his laboratory. He called it his oscillator. The device barely filled a man's palm, yet it produced vibrations powerful enough to rattle walls, windows, and eventually the street outside. Witnesses described the unsettling sight of structures trembling on a block that otherwise remained still. By the time police arrived, worried locals swore an actual earthquake must be breaking underfoot. Instead of tectonic fury, they found Tesla laughing quietly, pleased by the chaos caused by his mechanical rhythm machine. The device worked on resonance, the principle that every object has a natural frequency, a pitch it vibrates at most readily. Strike a tuning fork and its partner vibrates in sympathy. Push a swing at the right interval, and it soars higher with less effort. Tesla's small oscillator played with the same physics on structural scales. A beam in a building, a bridge's span, a skyscraper's frame, all of them could hum violently if vibrated at the right frequency. It terrified those who saw it firsthand. In their minds, a diode or switch had no business threatening the stability of steel-framed architecture. Yet under Tesla's hands, a handheld oscillator could set whole walls trembling. They imagined catastrophe, Bridges torn into dust, towers collapsing, cities dismantled not by dynamite but by invisible harmonics. But Tesla imagined something entirely different. In his vision, resonance wasn't destruction, it was harmony. The same principle that could shake structures apart could instead bind them closer to survival. If buildings could be tuned to vibrate in step with the Earth's shudders, earthquakes might cease to hold menace. Instead of toppling, structures would ride out tremors, swaying in balance with soil and rock. Where others saw weaponry and resonance, Tesla saw design, a breathing architecture, flexible, resilient, alive with the frequencies buried in the earth. To him, the oscillator was no terror. It was perhaps the first sketch of earthquake-proof cities. Now picture urban skylines in that reality. Consider the towers of Tokyo, not braced temporarily with dampers, but imbued permanently with oscillator systems, their skeletons humming subtly beneath the wind. Or San Francisco reborn after 1906, its structures refusing to fall as tectonic tremors rolled through, harmonizing instead until calm returned. What modern societies still treat as inevitable disaster would, in Tesla's world, become routine. An earthquake's lethality could be disarmed. Entire cities might exhale, finally released from fear of collapse. Citizens would not flee shaking buildings. They would stand inside the rhythm, knowing each sway was simply life aligning with hidden forces. Today, engineers account for resonance carefully, but always as an enemy to subdue. High-rise buildings incorporate shock absorbers, tuned mass dampers, flexible joints, all tools to avoid dangerous oscillations that could spiral toward destruction. Bridges extend with hinges designed to prevent resonance from compounding into failure. We build against resonance, never with it. Tesla imagined the opposite. Structures not resisting vibration but embracing it, designed like instruments rather than monoliths. Imagine a city not of rigid cubes, but of flexible symphonies, tones of steel and stone humming together as the planet shifted subtly. Instead of cracking foundations, you might hear faint vibrations ripple downward, like a city inhaling under stress before settling still again. Think of the paradox here. The very power that panicked onlookers in his lab could have been the power that eradicated panic from cities prone to seismic chaos. If Tesla had time, resources, and the supportive environment to scale his oscillator work, earthquake-resistant buildings may have emerged a century earlier. Seismology as a discipline would have co-evolved with oscillator construction. Where researchers today record tremors, Tesla's schools of engineering might have actively tuned their buildings to match. Each home, office, civic tower would be built upon resonant harmony rather than rigid calculation, part of a deeper orchestration between human architecture and the earth below. But in Tesla's own day, resonance was viewed through narrower lenses. Shock ripples from collapsed bridges, accounts of soldiers and physicists speculating on destruction. It was easy to imagine the oscillator as weapon. The line between invention and threat blurred sharply. Reporters, hearing rumours of Tesla's machine that could topple Manhattan with vibrations, certainly preferred the sensational. Tesla himself sometimes stoked those rumours, half amused, half frustrated, as he tried to communicate that the true potential lay in protection, not collapse. He had, after all, lived long enough by then to know how quickly financiers lost interest in peace, and how eagerly they reached toward weapons. The world might already be walking through earthquake-proof cities if his oscillator had been welcomed rather than feared. Picture stepping into a skyscraper in Mexico City during a quake, and feeling the whole building sway like a great pendulum, furniture tilting gently, glass chiming slightly, but returning steady, safe. Imagine insurance companies recalibrating economies without entire neighbourhoods reduced to rubble. Billions in reconstruction costs never spent. Trauma and death dramatically reduced. City planning freed from the boundaries of seismic fear could expand anywhere. Rooted not in caution, but confidence. Tesla was not just playing with a machine in his lab, he may have been sketching the outlines of a fundamentally safer civilization. Think also of how this approach would alter education in architecture and engineering. Instead of teaching future builders to eliminate oscillation, schools would train them to study resonance patterns, to listen to a structure's tone the way a musician listens to pitch. Engineers might walk with tuning rods, matching frequencies of soil, bedrock and steel, adjusting oscillators until the combined song balanced against the Earth's pulse. Buildings would not be silent so much as orchestrated, communities of tone absorbing and releasing tremors in rhythmic calm. In such a world, earthquakes would shift from chaos into choreography. Humanity would have aligned itself to the Earth not by battling but by dancing. Of course, what we are describing flies in the face of how modern construction unfolds. Our skyscrapers stiffen themselves with excessive reinforcement. Dams tie themselves down against vibration. Bridges overwrite natural oscillations with angled supports. We admire the stubbornness of these structures, their denial of movement. In Tesla's eyes, such stubbornness was folly. To refuse resonance was to refuse nature's instruction. The machine humming softly in his lab may have pointed out a different lesson. Survival doesn't arrive through rigidity. It arrives through rhythm. Flexibility saves, while resistance cracks. In this alternate reality, our skylines would look less defiant and more alive. Sleek towers swaying like stalks, bridges thrumming like strings, homes equipped with foundations able to rock gently back and forth. Cities would look unstable but feel indestructible. People might even find comfort in vibrations, a reminder that their homes were breathing with the earth rather than sealed away from it. Fear would soften into familiarity. Maybe faint hums would join the background of city life, percussion beneath our daily bustle, unnoticed after years but vital when disaster struck. What most of us now call catastrophe might be reframed as a simple performance of resonance physics. And while harmony was Tesla's dream, the darker potential inevitably shadowed the machine. If one oscillator could protect, another aimed differently could destroy. That paradox surrounds many of Tesla's inventions, utopia and disaster only a turn apart. His resonance device thus sits as both promise and threat. The newspapers preferred the terror. Historians linger on the demonstration that shook his New York lab enough to summon police. Forgotten more often is the alternate path. Resilient architecture humming in tune with the soil under every human settlement. He was not imagining chaos but conjuring a scaffold of order. So you can hear the speculative hum even now. Each quake that ravages neighbourhoods hints at the road not taken. Each televised collapse imagines what might have been if cities had listened to Tesla's suggestion of resonance, not dismissed it as madness. Somewhere between weapon and miracle sat his oscillator, dismissed too quickly, cut short, remembered through fragments of rumour. His earthquake machine may not have been just another curiosity lost to history. It may have been the first breath of indestructible, breathing architecture. And if he could steady a building against the violence of the earth, if he could turn catastrophe into rhythm, what else might he have tried to steady? What might he have dreamed of doing if the tremors came not from soil but from war, hunger, and the violent rhythms of nations? Could peace have come from a weapon so terrifying it promised to end all wars? Imagine a world where battlefields disappeared not because humans became kinder, but because the sheer dread of one invention made violence a losing gamble. Nikola Tesla spent his last decades insisting that such a thing was not only possible, but already within his grasp. He called it Teleforce, though newspapers eagerly branded it the death ray. To them it sounded like something out of penny science fiction. To Tesla, it was the ultimate deterrent, a way to render armies and navies obsolete by making them vulnerable to an invisible, unstoppable beam capable of cutting their very machinery to ribbons mid-flight. Picture Tesla in his cramped New York hotel room, thin and frail by then, his desk cluttered with sketches and notes, the city's noise seeping faintly through the window. The room smells of dust, unwashed clothes, and paper growing brittle with age. Yet in this solitude, he envisions a weapon not of bullets or fire, but of directed energy. His proposal described a system that would project concentrated streams of particles through the air, moving so fast and with such intensity that they could slice through airplanes or melt armour. In Tesla's vision, you could stand on the shore of a nation and bring down entire fleets 250 miles away without ever leaving your territory. It was power without invasion, dominance without risk of occupation. Governments learned of these claims and reacted with a mixture of hunger and unease. On the one hand, what state would not want exclusive access to a machine promising absolute defence? On the other, what government could fully trust a man whose ideas often wandered into strangeness and whose devices sometimes seemed closer to myth than reality? Imagine the tension in those offices. Advisory committees debating whether Tesla's diagrams represented brilliance or delusion, administrators whispering whether they should fund him for fear of another nation seizing the chance first. Salvation and paranoia marched together. His vision of a planetary shield began attracting both suspicion and intrigue, the kind of contradictory atmosphere Tesla had lived within all his life. Skeptics remained vocal. To them, the weapon made no sense within known physics. There was no clear evidence of sustained particle beams powerful enough to act across such distances. Critics insisted that Tesla was exaggerating, concocting fantasies either in desperation to revive his dwindling finances or to preserve his reputation as the neglected genius of modern science. Yet Tesla never faltered in claiming its reality. To him, Teleforce was less a dream than an inevitability waiting for backers brave enough to finish construction. His confidence remained absolute, a conviction pulsing through his private letters, just as it had in youth when he promised himself to master the world's energy. Accounts of the machine circulated. Some described shields surrounding entire nations, invisible walls deterring invasion by making every hostile aircraft into a liability. Others whispered about demonstrations where beams sliced steel like fabric, melting metal mid-air before it struck its mark. Journalists embellished these fragments into vivid tales of instantaneous defense, of death falling without warning from invisible hands. The phrase "death ray" settled permanently into the public imagination, less because of its accuracy, and more because it married fear and fascination in ways that headlines loved. For Tesla, the name misled. He did not think of it primarily as a weapon to kill, but as a guardian to prevent. Study his choice of words and you notice the irony. Teleforce to him meant transmitted force, not death itself. He spent his career insisting that humanity needed abundance of power rather than scarcity of violence. So why build such a device? His logic echoed deterrence centuries before nuclear strategies codified the idea. If every border could be cloaked by an impenetrable field of invisible energy, he argued, then nations would have no incentive to send soldiers across frontiers or provoke neighbours. War would become economically and strategically useless. Tragedy, in his mind, could be neutralised by awe. Fear itself would guarantee peace. Now step with me into an alternate timeline where this bizarre concept worked. Picture Europe in the 1930s, its political map sharpening with menace. Germany expands aggressively. Italy dreams of empire. Japan marches through Asia. But in this version, Tesla's death ray has already been deployed. Imagine colossal transmitters humming quietly on national borders, systems ready to unleash invisible streams that guarantee annihilation of any intruding fleet. Planes cannot cross. Warships refuse to advance. Tanks hesitate at invisible perimeters. Here, Hitler's speeches fall on hollow ears, because every soldier knows armour cannot stop the beam. If that reality had existed, would invasions grind to a halt before they began? Would concentration camps never rise because territorial expansion proved impossible? Such speculations cannot be answered definitively, but the mere image unsettles us into wondering. Think of the economic consequences. Military industries, anxiously building rifles, artillery, ships and planes, might find themselves obsolete overnight. Factories once rumbling with war contracts would either close or be forced to shift toward peaceful industry. Engineers designing bombers could instead be tasked with building faster passenger planes, because dogfights were pointless. Borders would resemble glowing barriers, less like fragile lines on paper, and more like solid walls drawn by intense beams. Armies themselves might collapse into little more than ceremonial forces. Standing militaries, for the first time in history, might no longer serve purpose. Humanity's centuries of organised warfare could wither under technological intimidation, rather than moral progress. Yet consider the paradox. Peace achieved not by compassion, diplomacy or justice, but by terror. No country fought not because it valued harmony, but because fear of annihilation paralysed it. Would such peace hold, or would nations race to secretly undermine shields, invent counterbeams, push for escalation? Wherever deterrence thrives, so does mistrust. One state claiming possession of the death ray inspires others to steal its secrets or to construct their own in defence. The balance becomes fragile. Safety rests on trust, and trust is fragile when invisible beams capable of instant destruction float above borders. Tesla's hope for deterrence could as easily inspire new varieties of paranoia and clandestine arms races. Modern scholars continue to argue about it. Some study his technical notes and conclude that the plan contained kernels of legitimate physics, charged particles accelerated through vacuum tubes, beams magnified by potential differences, concepts preceding the development of particle accelerators by decades. Others dismiss it as exaggeration, the last dreams of a man sidelined from mainstream science, hopeful to secure funding in old age. Without prototypes, the truth remains suspended between possibility and fantasy. The absence of hardware left Teleforce drifting in ambiguity, too plausible to laugh away, too unverified to embrace as fact. That ambiguity became part of Tesla's legacy itself. If you pause and think carefully, Tesla's so-called death ray echoes the themes of his earlier inventions. His oscillator threatened to topple buildings, yet could also protect them. His tower promised to light the world without charge, yet scared financiers into retreat. Teleforce, likewise, balanced at the edge between terror and hope, imagined as a machine of mass death, yet articulated as an end to killing. One cannot step into Tesla's mind without recognizing this duality. Every gift shadowed by fear, every marvel capable of menace. He seemed less an inventor of discrete tools than a conjurer of paradoxes, each one daring us to ask whether humanity chooses construction or destruction. Imagine again our present day with Tesla's deterrent woven into history. Would the 20th century be remembered as a period without the catastrophic world wars, an age where new societies flourished under enforced borders? Or would conflict have simply shifted inside those barriers, erupting as civil wars or proxy battles because external invasion proved impossible? Peace at gunpoint, so to speak, rarely becomes true peace. Perhaps Tesla's machine might have frozen large conflict even as smaller ones multiplied. Perhaps his deterrent would have preserved human lives at unimaginable scale, while suffocating freedom within new fortresses of paranoia. In his own framing, though, Teleforce was emphatically defensive. He insisted no one nation could wield it for conquest, because its range was limited to boundaries. Stand within your land, activate the machine, and your territory becomes invulnerable. In his view, this would erase aggression's value. For the first time, nations would hold equal protection regardless of size. A small nation, often victim of invasion, could guard itself as thoroughly as empires. Whether you accept his physics or not, the vision itself carried radical political implications. Equality through power, stability through threat, universal independence by way of universal menace. Critics might smile grimly here, pointing out that nuclear weapons later followed a near-identical pattern. Immense destructive potential inspiring deterrence more than use. The difference is that nuclear options still demanded active attack to demonstrate power. Tesla's beam, if real, would have offered omnipresent shield instead of retaliatory strike. The contrast is subtle but important. Deterrence through defense rather than retaliation. His design meant to invert war logic altogether. Invaders could not succeed. In his mind, that meant war itself would have no incentive. He wanted a silent guarantee, not a visible mushroom cloud after loss of millions. And so the man who had lit Chicago's fairgrounds in splendor, who had promised energy to every hut and palace through Wardenclyffe's dome, ended his career sketching diagrams of a device most remembered as a killing machine. He lived in paradox until the end. Was it genius physics sparking ahead of its time, or a clever exaggeration spun from his hunger for recognition and funding? Was it the first great dream of directed energy weapons, or the final prayer of a visionary watching himself displaced by a world chasing simpler technologies? We will likely never know. What we can hold is the alternate image he suggested, uneasy yet strangely compelling. War machines abandoned in rust, generals dismissed not through peace treaties, but through a single equation of fear. In Tesla's narrative, the death ray was never about death. It was about stopping it before it began. His beams sought to render killing obsolete, leaving behind only a quiet equilibrium where nations existed separately, unable to touch, unable to destroy. A cruel calculus, perhaps, but also a potential salvation unseen in history. And if you stand with that thought a moment longer, you realize Tesla's oddest paradox. Even his most frightening idea was born from his deepest longing, not to dominate, but to protect. He wished for humanity not a darker age of weapons, but the sudden obsolescence of all weapons. That is what distinguished him, and kept his name lodged strangely between myth and science. His beam was never pointed outward to kill. In his mind, it was pointed inward to restrain us from ever killing again. Yet as haunting as such a vision might be, stranger still were the moments when Tesla believed forces beyond Earth itself were trying to speak to us. Because for all the attention we give his death ray, he quietly carried a conviction that whispers from the stars had once reached his laboratory. What if humanity's first brush with voices from beyond this planet didn't happen in an age of radio telescopes, satellites, or moon landings, but instead in a lonely Colorado lab where the thin air smelled of ozone and the ground rattled faintly with electrical storms? Picture Nikola Tesla standing inside his experimental station near Colorado Springs at the turn of the 20th century, his tall frame lit now and then by faint blue sparks crawling along the walls. The air outside was dry, almost desolate, the kind of vast western night that lets stars burn with a clarity few city eyes ever meet. In this setting, Tesla believed he had pressed his machines into rhythm with something greater than Earth alone. His instruments testing the resonance of electrical signals through the atmosphere began producing an irregular series of pulses, sharp, distinct and unsettlingly patterned. To Tesla's mind, randomness was one thing, but rhythm belonged to intelligence. He became convinced those blips were not static at all, but deliberate attempts at communication from worlds beyond our own. Now imagine your own reaction in that room. Flickering arcs hiss around you, copper coils emit low vibrations, the timber frame creaks in the dry chill of night. Suddenly, through headphones or through the delicate needles of recording instruments, a beat emerges. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Then again, repeated, elongated, never quite drifting into noise. For Tesla, who had spent his entire career separating signal from chaos, the difference mattered profoundly. He had listened to the earth, tuned into its resonances, mapped the thunderstorm's pulse, memorized the patterns of current. Yet this seemed new. These repeating blips unsettled him because they implied agency. Somewhere beyond the hills and the atmosphere, perhaps even beyond the reach of ordinary telescopes, someone or something appeared to be speaking. And to Tesla, it was not simply a scientific anomaly. It might have been proof of companionship in the cosmos. The skepticism from others arrived quickly. Fellow scientists shrugged, suggesting Tesla had intercepted atmospheric interference, disturbances in Earth's upper layers where electricity tends to wander like restless wind. Others suspected he was picking up signals from experiments at different locations on Earth, especially as radio research was just beginning to spread internationally. Yet Tesla himself rejected these explanations. The frequency seemed too organized, too unlike the jagged unpredictability of lightning or the crude transmissions of human radio. To him, these pulses carried intention, and he was so certain that for a time he proposed the idea that the signals hailed from Mars, a planet then imagined by many to harbour canals, civilizations, perhaps even engineers peering into the sky as curiously as we peered back at them. Consider the cultural mood of the late 19th century. Telescopes were growing sharper, showing clearer details of planets. The astronomer Percival Lowell wrote confidently of Martian canals, interpreting faint lines as proof of advanced engineering across barren deserts. Newspapers ran with these claims, and fiction writers filled their pages with stories of Martian invasions or cosmic neighbours. Against this backdrop, Tesla's announcement that he had heard signals added fuel to imaginations already burning. To ordinary readers, it seemed less outlandish than it might to us now. Mars was close. Mars seemed active. Why not Mars sending coded greetings into the void? Tesla may have stepped directly into that zeitgeist, offering scientific legitimacy to an idea hovering between speculation and hope. You can sense his personal excitement in the way he spoke about it later. Where others imagined unfriendly invasions, his own interpretation was softer, calmer. He saw no fear in contact. He imagined societies older than ours, civilizations perhaps wiser, seeking connection rather than conflict. For him, the prospect of alien communication reaffirmed his broader philosophy, that the universe teemed with vibrancy, that nature overflowed with intelligence rather than silence. He believed humanity was reaching the threshold of connection, that technology might finally bridge not only continents but planets. And in that conviction, Tesla blurred the line between scientific exploration and the realm we now call science fiction. So let's pause and linger on what it means if Tesla was right, even partly. Imagine an alternate 20th century where those signals he heard in Colorado Springs were accepted as genuine extraterrestrial messages. Governments might have redirected resources immediately from wartime industries into planetary communication projects, building enormous transmitters not for propaganda or news broadcasts, but for answering voices across space. Instead of pouring billions into battleships and trenches during the First World War, funds might have gone into colossal antenna arrays, orbital observatories, or even experimental craft attempting to close the gap with Mars. The race toward the stars might have begun decades earlier, not in the Cold War, but in the dawn of wireless research itself. But in our reality, skepticism swayed history. Modern scholars suggest that Tesla most likely picked up early radio signals generated not by aliens, but by thunderstorms bouncing electromagnetic waves off the ionosphere, or possibly rudimentary long-distance transmissions from other experimenters already running wireless tests in Europe. Cosmic sources may also have been in play, natural phenomena such as pulsars, rotating neutron stars producing regular bursts of radio energy. At the time of Tesla's experiments, none of this was yet mapped or understood. The cosmos did produce rhythms, but not necessarily civilizations. Tesla lacked the context to sort these possibilities clearly, so he chose the one most thrilling to him: intelligence from the stars. That choice inspired more wonder than dismissal in the public's memory, because a genius declaring Martian contact was simply more captivating than a dry explanation of atmospheric interference. The persistence of his belief matters as much as the actual cause of the signals. By defending the possibility of extraterrestrial communication, Tesla gave a kind of permission for others to explore the same dream. Writers leaned heavily on the idea, blending his authority into their pages, curious inventors tinkered with makeshift receivers, hoping to capture voices of distant worlds. The cultural imagination shifted subtly, because one respected engineer said with conviction that he had heard someone else in the cosmic silence. And once the idea is out, once people picture it, the direction of human aspiration tilts permanently toward the sky. Now, consider the broader implications if Tesla's assumption had proven correct. Humanity's first contact might have been auditory rather than visual. Instead of gazing at the stars with optical instruments, we would have first listened, like children pressing ears to a wall to hear neighbours on the other side. Our earliest diplomacy with extraterrestrials could have been sound, repeating pulses, mathematical rhythms, the cosmic equivalent of knocking politely before introducing words. How would that have shaped us? Perhaps languages grounded more in harmonics, mathematics elevated as universal expression, international cooperation rapidly compelled toward decoding messages rather than competing for terrestrial resources. One can imagine entire schools devoted to cosmic linguistics springing up by the early 1900s. Yet if such contact occurred, fear might have been inevitable as well. Signals imply senders, and senders imply technologies beyond ours. Would governments conceal discoveries out of caution, claiming national security trumped collective wonder? Would military industries attempt to weaponize cosmic knowledge before sharing it? The paradox remains. Connection inspires both kinship and anxiety. In that sense, Tesla's claim foreshadowed the dilemmas we still face today whenever new knowledge pushes the boundary of human identity. Back in Colorado, however, the signals ended as mysteriously as they began. Tesla recorded them, speculated publicly about their origin, then drifted into other projects. The lab itself closed soon after, moonlit nights giving way to debts, relocations, and new experiments unravelled by lack of funding. But the memory persisted. Long afterward, in his writings and interviews, Tesla returned to the conviction that he had once brushed against extraterrestrial communication. He never walked back the claim. For him, it stood as proof waiting for humanity to catch up. Whether accurate or not, it kept his name connected not only to alternating current, towers, and oscillators, but also to the grandest speculation of all, that we are not alone. Think of what lasting impact that conviction had on culture. Later contact hypotheses, search programs, even radio astronomy itself often carry a trace of Tesla's shadow. The man who envisioned towers vibrating with planetary resonance also envisioned signals arriving from beyond planetary resonance. His cosmos was alive, never empty. That outlook, repeated across decades, helped stitch wonder into the foundation of scientific exploration. In that sense, his hearing of signals in Colorado was more than a private hallucination or error. It was a story planted into collective imagination, one that continues to echo through science and art alike. So whether Tesla intercepted cosmic pulses or faulty echoes of his own experiments hardly matters anymore. The idea that he might have listened in on an alien transmission created ripples across generations, blurring boundaries between laboratory demonstration and myth-making. In that blurred space, humanity finds a strange comfort that even mistakes can inspire futures. Tesla may have been listening to storms, or he may have tuned himself to stars, but the deeper truth is that he listened differently than anyone else dared. That difference left us wondering, what if we really did answer back in 1900? How different would tonight's world feel? When Tesla walked out of Colorado Springs for the last time, the wooden walls of his lab already rattled from disrepair, he carried with him more than notebooks. He carried a conviction that somewhere out there voices waited. As he returned east, fading gradually into the chaotic cadence of New York life, that belief stayed firm. And even if modern science dismisses his conclusion, his story provokes reflection. Not all discoveries that matter are true. Some continue to matter because they spark longing, direction, curiosity. Tesla's signals became one of those sparks, and so his cosmic imagination joined the long catalogue of his paradoxes, part science, part speculation, all wonder. To some listeners, he was mistaken. To others, he was simply ahead of human capability. What remains undeniable is that his brief brush with rhythmic pulses blurred everything: myth and method, science and story, physics and philosophy. In that moment, Tesla bent technology not just to power machines, but to ask one of the oldest human questions: are we alone? His answer was a quiet conviction, spoken not with data but with resonance, a conviction that behind the static someone had just said hello. And even after Tesla's death, whispers persisted that fragments of such discoveries, real or imagined, were not lost at all. They were gathered, locked, and hidden, stored away in trunks that vanished into government archives, waiting silently for another moment in history to surface again. What if the missing boxes from Tesla's estate contained technologies no one was ready to see? Imagine walking into a small New York hotel room on a cold January morning in 1943. The curtains hang half open, the radiator knocks faintly, and the air is stale with dust that never quite leaves the corners. On the bed lies Nikola Tesla, lifeless at 86, his body frail, his pockets empty. Just hours later, men arrived to sift through the remnants of a life that never fit comfortably into the age around him. Among the old coats, broken machines, and stacks of scattered notes, they find trunks. Not one or two trunks, but dozens, some tall as wardrobes, others small and worn at the edges, but all sealed, locked, and heavy with paper. By evening, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has moved in, and those trunks vanish from the hotel room into government custody. Officially, the files contain nothing beyond scattered musings of a brilliant but aged inventor. Unofficially, the record is blurrier, stitched with contradictions and rumours about designs too striking to leave in ordinary hands. In the calm of that hotel room, the scene seems unremarkable. Government agents cataloguing the effects of an old man who died in debt. Yet whispers quickly scatter through the corridors of science and politics. Tesla had once written about particle beams that could obliterate entire squadrons, about towers channeling limitless wireless energy, about signals trickling in from outer space. How reassuring could it be to know that 80 trunks of notes and diagrams now lay beyond public reach, sealed inside archives with uncertain intentions? In the days that followed, the official statement was blunt. Nothing of value was found. No working prototypes. No breakthroughs. No material the United States government thought worth protecting. But alongside that dismissal, reports swirled that out of Tesla's 80 trunks, only a fraction ever reached catalogues. Some say 30 were formally inventoried, while others quietly vanished, siphoned into private vaults or unmarked boxes stacked deep inside federal warehouses where light rarely visits. Now think of the questions that stir whenever trunks disappear. What does absence mean? Safety, secrecy, or indifference? Official records suggest all discoveries were incomplete, scattered fragments unworthy of further pursuit. But the rumours elicit a different picture. Drawings of the Wardenclyffe system modified into portable models, diagrams of Teleforce equipment promising beams of destruction or defence, meticulous notes on resonance experiments hinting at possibilities still not realised today. Among Tesla's papers may also have been his observations of rhythmic signals from Colorado Springs, notes he insisted recorded attempts at contact from Mars. Did the government dismiss these as eccentric delusions, or were they tucked away to avoid fueling panic during years already bracing for global war? The absence of answers hardened curiosity into legend. Every trunk not catalogued became a box of Schrödinger's inventions, possibly empty, possibly extraordinary, and irretrievably hidden. Picture yourself on that January morning again, standing behind the agents as stacks of notes are carried out to waiting vans. You cannot peer inside, only imagine what each folder holds. The hum of the city outside continues unchanged, unaware of the paper migration happening quietly in the hotel corridors. it is easy to think of history as shaped solely by public events, speeches, battles, elections. Yet sometimes it twists irrevocably in silence within the confiscation of a dead man's belongings. Tesla's estate, whatever its content, represented not only unfinished experiments, but an entire philosophy, energy free to all, technology serving humanity without gatekeepers. When those trunks disappeared, the possibility of that philosophy reaching daylight again dwindled. Instead, the government carried away not just papers, but the lingering hope of a different technological path. Years later, documents declassified through intermittent requests revealed at least one certainty. Security agencies had monitored Tesla closely in his final decades. Notes existed of concern over his foreign contacts, his claims of advanced weaponry, and his potentially sensitive inventions. What may have seemed the ramblings of a fringe genius were taken seriously enough to warrant federal attention. That seriousness itself fueled suspicion. If his drawings and prototypes were nothing but dreams stitched loosely with physics, why bother collecting them at all? Why not leave them scattered to relatives or museums? The decision to confiscate them, then insist they contained nothing of value, creates a tension too sharp to dismiss. Were agencies protecting the country from antagonists who might misuse Tesla's half-finished schemes? Or were they testing them quietly in back rooms, benefiting from discoveries never attributed to him in public record? Consider what might have happened if those trunks had entered open circulation. In them, perhaps we might have discovered refinements of coil design that anticipated modern wireless charging, expanded not for handheld devices but for whole towns. Maybe diagrams showing how oscillation principles applied not just to small machines, but to the very foundations of buildings, offering earthquake resistance far earlier than 20th century engineering achieved. Perhaps blueprints of beam technology hinting at controlled energy streams, ideas that would later echo through particle physics and directed energy weapons research. Or handwritten accounts noting rhythms in cosmic signals, a precursor to radio astronomy written in Tesla's slanted European hand. Even if the science were incomplete, even if flawed in execution, the imagination contained inside could have seeded generations of inquiries. By removing those trunks, governments ensured not just ownership over the contents, but control over who was allowed to even dream along those lines. The rumours of missing trunks also intersect uncomfortably with the timing of geopolitical anxiety. Tesla died in 1943, in the middle of a world war where energy and weaponry dictated survival. Nuclear projects swelled in secret laboratories, radar spread across battlefields, communication networks tightened their web. Within that climate, an eccentric genius's notes on unlimited energy and impenetrable defense beams would have seemed dangerous whether real or not. The mere rumour of them falling into enemy hands might have spurred their seizure. In this light, the missing trunks need not contain functioning designs. Possibility alone might have been worth suppressing. Secrecy becomes not about what the papers proved, but about preventing others from believing they could prove it. Belief, after all, spurs research, and research may one day yield realization. So you're left wondering, did governments suppress Tesla's discoveries for safety, locking them away until civilization matured into readiness? Or did they hide them for power, siphoning concepts into closed research while ordinary citizens assumed the work lost? Both interpretations carry unease. In one, benevolent guardianship withholds treasures until society can handle them. In the other, monopolies in power ensure control by hoarding concepts that might have freed humanity from dependence on cords, grids, and bills. And in either scenario, the world outside continues along the path we know. Wires strung along poles, nations at war for resources, inventions diffused through markets slower than imagination allowed. Whenever journalists in later decades pried for answers, the responses circled the same phrases. No revolutionary secrets found. No usable design present, nothing worth pursuit. Yet the numbers do not align. 80 trunks claimed, 30 catalogued. Where did the others go? Were they simply lost, misplaced between archives, miscounted in clerical error? Or did they slip deliberately into select hands, traded quietly between agencies that never speak of their projects aloud? The absence creates its own mythology. What we do not see becomes fertile ground for speculation. Each missing trunk fills, in our minds, with wireless grids lighting continents or devices that could deter wars before they begin. The truth is that absence preserves Tesla's vision as effectively as proof. If the trunks had been released and found to contain only incoherent scribbles, perhaps the legend would fade. If revealed to contain genuine breakthroughs, panic or radical changes might have followed. But hiding them ensures a limbo where hope cannot die. Tesla's ghosts remain active precisely because his final work exists only behind curtains of secrecy. Every rumour of vanished designs recalls Wardenclyffe's dome, the oscillator's hum, the tapping signals in Colorado. In missing trunks, people imagine their rebirth. As long as those boxes remain untraceable, Tesla never fully leaves. His alternate futures hover near, always one unlocked trunk away. Stand for a moment in that hotel hallway in 1943 as agents close latches and carry Tesla's life out into waiting trucks. You smell the stale carpet, hear the scrape of metal corners against the doorframe, feel the chill of January air drifting in behind them. The inventor lies still inside, his mortal work complete. But his ideas, boxed and carried away, continue to live clandestine lives, whispered about decades later in documentaries, forums, and speculative histories. It is as though his mind traded mortality for myth, ensuring his second existence began the moment the trunks left public reach. Each box acts as both coffin and cradle, closing one life, birthing countless imaginary ones. The missing trunks, whether filled with revolutionary technology or not, changed Tesla's afterlife. They remind us that secrecy exerts its own magnetic pull. Our world was denied closure. Instead, we inherited a mystery. And out of that mystery rises the suspicion that Tesla's vision hasn't truly vanished, only continued beneath the surface. Perhaps somewhere a locked government archive still houses brittle pages describing how to resonate with the Earth, how to send particles screaming through air, how to draw signals from stars. Or perhaps the trunks were mundane all along, shredded quietly, legends left to grow organically outside facts. Either way, mystery ensures Tesla's world remains unfinished. He's still with us, hidden between the lines of official statements, lingering in the gaps of missing catalogues. And decades later, fragments of his vision began resurfacing elsewhere, stitched into technologies we now treat as ordinary. Wireless signals, charging without cords, the pursuit of clean, endless power. Ideas that first seemed buried with him re-emerged quietly in unexpected ways, circulating through labs and households, whispering back toward the man whose boxes vanished, but whose imagination still leaks into our everyday lives. What if the remnants of Tesla's imagination already surround you every day without you realizing it? You plug your phone in each night, but a faint echo of his dream hides in the wireless chargers, now spreading through bedrooms and coffee shops. You drive past a row of sleek electric cars, humming quietly rather than growling, and you unknowingly watch his fingerprints glide by on 4 silent wheels. The conversation you're listening to right now flows through invisible waves in the air, as ordinary as background noise but once so extraordinary that Tesla risked his reputation to prove it possible. Everywhere you look, remnants of his vision are stitched discreetly into daily life. But the difference is this. In Tesla's mind, these technologies weren't meant to be special features sold at premium cost. They were to be commons, no more restricted than the oxygen around you. And the fact that you know them primarily as luxuries hints at the real tension between his dream and our present. Consider your own relationship with electricity today. You probably don't stop to think about where it comes from. A switch flicks, a bulb glows, and it feels natural. The wires above your street seem permanent, the bills arriving each month expected. That assumption that power must always be mediated by wires, systems, and corporations is itself a legacy of a world where Tesla lost. In his version, energy would be ambient. Phones wouldn't sip from cords because they'd never lose power to begin with. Cars wouldn't park at charging stations, but cruise forever, drawing seamlessly from currents humming invisibly through the earth. Factories wouldn't pause for outages because no storm could snap the lines required. They simply wouldn't exist. You live surrounded by vestiges of his ideas, but only in fragmentary form. Instead of freedom, they remain locked in markets, bartered like rare goods. Imagine waking up tomorrow inside Tesla's alternate reality. Your alarm clock hums alive, not because it drained your phone overnight, but because it continuously harvested energy drifting through the surrounding air. You step into your car without ever glancing at a battery indicator, because the vehicle draws power directly as it moves. The streetlights lining your road continue to glow without attachment to poles or buried cables. And inside each skyscraper around you, oscillating frameworks respond to the Earth's vibrations. Tremors shake the ground, but towers bend in rhythm instead of falling. The morning news doesn't mention casualties from a quake in Chile or Japan because quake deaths are a relic of another timeline. Scarcity of energy never dictates where people live, nor does cost divide homes into darkness or light. Everything is powered because everything is immersed in the same planetary current. Tesla imagined a world where abundance erased the economics of control. Now contrast that vision with what humanity actually built. You scroll through your phone and watch the battery icon drain, thinking about where to find a cord. Your electric car, if you can afford one, forces you to plan around specific charging stations. A blackout in your city reduces skyscrapers to cold dark stones despite decades of progress. Scarcity, not abundance, defines reality. What Tesla pictured as an air soaked in free power became instead a tightly managed commodity. Companies meter every moment of use, every kilowatt tracked, priced and profited upon. The imagination that he poured into Wardenclyffe Tower, the promise of energy as natural as breathing, remains unrealized, not because it was fully impossible, but because economics prevailed over experiment. Let's talk about that boundary between imagination and technology. For more than a century, engineers worldwide have explored wireless power in smaller scales. Induction coils charge your toothbrush without wires. Pads pass energy into smartphones. Laboratory setups demonstrate beams transmitting electricity across open space with surprising efficiency. In research hallways at institutions like MIT, experiments move beyond novelty. Concepts for wireless energy grids float around as prototypes, no longer dismissed as fantasy, but considered within engineering feasibility. NASA studies betrays a similar curiosity, exploring whether solar power collected in orbit might be beamed wirelessly back to Earth. Private companies test ways of delivering electricity to drones or machinery without ever plugging them in. The science itself is no longer magic. It is proving itself in controlled settings. Yet ask yourself why your daily experience still demands cords, sockets, and companies counting margins. The answer rarely lies in physics anymore. More often it lies in economics. Think quietly about that for a moment. Tesla argued that energy should be shared across humanity freely, in the same way sunlight touches every surface indiscriminately. Today we know how to build systems that approach this vision. The technology doesn't require an otherworldly leap. The problem lies in how to profit from ubiquity. If energy is harvested ambiently, who collects payment? If devices simply sip from the Earth's field, companies lose control over distribution. Where Tesla saw emancipation, investors saw lost income. And that may be the truest barrier standing between you and Tesla's alternate timeline. Not science, capitalism. Could it be that markets, not molecules, buried the world he tried to give you? Pause and look around your own space while you listen. Every glowing screen near you, phone, tablet, laptop, functions because of principles Tesla pioneered generations earlier. Alternating currents leap invisibly from distant stations to your walls. Coils, circuits, and transformers trace their DNA back to his papers and designs. The silent twist of an electric motor propelling a modern car contains his logic written in magnets. The wireless signals delivering this very narration echo his experiments with transmission through air. Tesla's fingerprints are already woven invisibly across your daily life, whether you recognize them or not. Yet you experience them piecemeal, always partitioned by bills, patents, and exclusive devices rather than integrated across society as he intended. It's tempting to picture Tesla as a man whose dreams were simply too far ahead in time. That story comforts us, suggesting the world wasn't ready. But his abandoned tower on Long Island reminds us that readiness is not purely about technical maturity, it's about whether societies choose certain futures over others. We were ready enough to string entire continents with copper lines, to manufacture billions of incandescent bulbs, to expand fossil energy across oceans. We might have chosen wireless grids instead. We might have chosen ambient power instead of pumps and pipes. To suggest we were not ready absolves the uncomfortable reality that a choice was made, and once you frame it as a choice, you must ask who decided. Think back on all the what-ifs trailing behind Tesla's footsteps, the hum of buildings resonant with quakes, the towers singing with wireless energy, the deterrence preventing war, the signals whispering from planets. Each fell partially into silence, partly because of physics, partly because of economics, but most of all because societies hesitated. You already walk through a partial Tesla world. But the completeness of that world, where energy is indistinguishable from a breath or a heartbeat, remains locked away. And if we are honest, it was not impossibility that locked it, but refusal. So tonight, as you sit under light bulbs powered by wires, as your phone camped on its charger sips energy metered by corporations, you live with fragments of Tesla's dream. And those fragments remind us of the question we can no longer avoid. The issue isn't what Tesla imagined. The issue is what we refuse to choose. Perhaps his greatest invention was not the coil or motor themselves, but the idea embedded within them, that progress could be abundant, invisible, and shared. Look around you. The echoes are everywhere, and yet the silence in between them tells you the rest of the story. Tesla's greatest invention may not have been a coil, a motor, or even the tower that haunted Long Island. It was the belief that human progress could flow invisibly, abundantly, like air itself. He imagined power not as something to hoard or ration, but as a shared element of existence, woven into daily life without borders or cost. In a parallel world where his vision triumphed, no one would ask, what if Tesla was still here? Tonight your lights glow by wires, but perhaps quietly they glow with his ghost too, still humming, still waiting just beyond the current.